Thanks for joining us for another edition of the Workers Podcast. Now, several weeks ago, we promised you a deep dive into the labor code of Antigua and Barbuda. And perhaps this document is one of the most essential and important, even critical documents when it comes to workers' rights. It is foundational. Now, I have here with me today as a guest on the Workers Podcast, Hugh Joseph. Now, he's going to guide us through some of the most important segments when it comes to workers' rights in the labor code. Hugh, thank you so much for being a part of the Workers Podcast.
It's my pleasure being here.
And I'll also inform you that Hugh Joseph is one of the senior industrial relations officers here at the Antigua and Barbuda Workers Union. Now, let's go into it. I'll start by asking you to give us a sort of overview of the most important sections in the labor code when it comes to workers' rights.
I think the most important section would be section C, or division C. That is the area of the code that most often gets called into play. And that division C is termed the basic employment division. That has 6 parts. Part 1 deals with the basic employment and what is required as somebody becomes employed, the documentation that is to be provided, the information that is to be shared with that employee. Section 2, or part 2 that is, has to do with your leave privileges. So we talk about sick leave, we talk about vacation. That is what part 2 deals with. Part 3 deals with remuneration and your hours of work. Part 4 deals with the computation of severance. And part 5 deals with the issue of unfair termination. It outlines the process that must be followed to ensure that an employee is not terminated. It gives the employer options as to how to deal with different situations that may arise within the workplace. And part 6, that is the administrative part and the miscellaneous, dealing with things like the labor inspector and the right that they have to visit the workplace at any time and to interview employees, managers and so forth, and ask for any documentation they may think necessary to ensure that the provisions of the labor code are being upheld in that particular workplace.
Okay. So you'd say it's quite comprehensive, really.
It is. And I must say, our labor code here in Antigua and Barbuda has been the benchmark for a number of territories within the Caribbean, in that they have patterned their code after ours. Wow. So yes, it is quite a comprehensive document. It provides for the handling of matters from beginning to end, right? It is complete.
And the interesting thing is, which I'm really happy that you're on the program today, you've been engaging with this document for as long as you've been involved in industrial relations, I'm sure well over 20 years.
Yes, started industrial relations, I would say maybe about 22 years ago, something, somewhere thereabouts, yeah.
So I could pretty much say you're an authority on this subject to some extent.
Yeah, to some extent.
All right, so let's begin this deep dive. Basic employment, part 1 of Division C of the Labor Code. I'm guessing this talks about your employment documents and some of the things that it involve at the very early stages of gaining employment. Tell us about that.
Well, even before you get to the employment documents, such as the job description and so forth, it tells you that you should not be discriminated against based on your political affiliation, your religious beliefs, your sexual orientation, your nationality, that sort of thing. So it sets that out to begin with, to say that persons are persons with the right to be employed, not no matter where it is they fall within our society.
Yeah.
Right? After that, it then moves on to say that within a particular period of time, 10 days of taking up the employment, the employer must provide you with certain documentation. It says that you have the right to know what your job entails. You must know, for instance, if you are going to be placed on probation, because some may think that probation is automatic. It is not. So the employer must state to you clearly that you are to serve a period of probation for whatever duration, not exceeding 3 months. It also says that you are to be making a living wage, a wage that ensures you're able to carry the basic requirements of life. It tells you that the employer can change your job description after time, but the employer must, in fact, write to you to advise you as to what the changes are concerning the job description. So again, anything that you can think of going into employment, that section of the labor code speaks to it.
A couple of things that you mentioned. You said that aspect, and the employer should communicate to you for example, your probation period, if there is a probationary period, as well as the terms and conditions of your employment. Can that communication, I know you said documentation, can it be verbal,
No.
or is it necessary, or is it particularly or specifically
It must be
in
in
writing?
writing. And I think the drafters of our labor code, they had foresight in that persons may legitimately forget what I say to them today.
Yeah.
But if you have a written document, you have it in your possession for reference. And the job description is important because it is the document by which you would be measured in terms of your performance, whether or not you're going to be successful at your probation.
Yeah.
Right. So that is important that it be in writing. And it is also in writing, so it is not open to the employer to just change it as he or she sees. Because while it makes provision for the employer to update the job description and the duties that you're carrying out, it has to be done within a certain, I would say, a certain scope, in that if you gain employment as a secretary, there are certain duties that you know are clerical in nature.
Correct, yeah.
And no one individual might be able to undertake all of them.
Yeah.
So you may swap out some for the others. For others, not that you are clerical and you're then asked to do something of a totally different nature, cleaning or
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So that is why it is important to have it in writing.
Okay. Now let's take a step back and drill down on something you mentioned. You spoke about probation. What is the stipulated period of probation, if there is, in the labor code? Because I understand that in some circumstances you can have very extended probationary period, depending, going from employer to employer, as the case might be. What are the stipulations and what are the common practices with regards to probation?
So if there's agreement to apply a probationary period, the labor code gives you a maximum of 3 months, 90 days. The labor code also makes provision for an extension, but only if there is a collective agreement in place with a union. So for instance, an environment that is not unionized, they are confined to the 3 months.
Okay.
Where there is a union in place, we would negotiate, or the employer may say, we may have need to go beyond the 3 months. So we want the opportunity to be able to go beyond the 3 months. And the unions would negotiate different periods beyond that 3 months. But outside of the union's negotiation, no. And I've seen the union negotiate in most instances, I would say 99% of the time, an additional 4 weeks, which essentially is a month.
Yeah.
Because if it is that you've been employed with me for 2-3 months, I think that is sufficient time for you to grasp what it is that is required and be able to carry out that function at a satisfactory level. If it is that I may think you need a little more time, it should not require you another 3 months, which is what some employers tend to do.
Yeah.
And then again, where there's no union, and they do it, and the employee maybe sometimes accept, not knowing that that is an illegal act. Right?
Okay. Another question for you, Brother Hugh. While I'm on employment, or while an individual is on probation, rather, what benefits, what entitlements, what privileges are they covered by on the labor code, as opposed to someone who is fully employed?
The labor code doesn't discriminate in that way, in that once you are an employee, you are an employee with all the benefits of the labor code. If there's anything that would be missing, I would say is the guarantee or that security, because the law does say while you're on probation, the employer can terminate without providing a reason. Just gives you 24 hours notice or payment in lieu of notice. Except apart from that, you are an employee once you're engaged. Yeah.
Get the
So
same
the
protections.
same protection in terms of your rights to sick leave and that sort of thing. Yes, you are entitled to all of those. I know there's this thing about you're not entitled to sick leave until you'd have completed probation. I don't know that that is a reasonable reading of the code. I know an individual serving probation may want to, at all times, put their best foot forward.
Yeah.
And so to be reporting sick, they may think it reflects poorly on them.
Yeah.
And so for that reason, they may not report sick, but they are entitled to sick leave once they are employed.
Yes, yes. Now, what areas of Part One, basic employment, of Division C, would you
So
wish to highlight?
So we're dealing with probation, and right after probation, it deals with the issue of notice. And as I just mentioned,
Yeah.
once you're on probation, you the employer can terminate without giving you any particular reason except for 24 hours notice or payment in lieu of notice. Once you would have passed the probationary period, the law requires that if the employer is going to terminate, the employer must provide notice that is equivalent to your pay interval. Meaning, if you are monthly paid, the employer must provide you with at least a month's notice. If you're weekly paid, likewise, the employer provides you with a week's notice. The other side of that, in terms of the employee, there's a debate as to what happens if an employee leaves the employment without giving equal notice as is required of the employer. From my reading of the code, it really presents no consequential issue to the employee, in that it says that the employer has the right, in the event that the employee gives inadequate notice. So the employee is monthly paid, they don't provide the month's notice. The employer can terminate by the period by which the notice is short.
Yeah.
So I'm monthly paid, I give you 2 weeks notice. The law is reasonably saying that the employer can terminate by that 2 weeks, because I'm short of 2 weeks, so the employer at that point can terminate.
Okay.
However, for an employee who may be leaving to go to another job, I'm leaving anyway. I'm going to another job. So what is really the consequence to me? And I know a number of employers are not comfortable with that particular aspect of the code. And talking about termination, Section 10, C10(1) requires that where the employer terminates, you must, or where the employer terminate the employment, the employer must, within 7 days of his decision to terminate, furnish to the employee a written statement outlining the precise reason for the termination. So that is a requirement that oftentimes is not met by the employer, either not met in terms of giving a precise reason or with respect to the 7-day requirement.
Okay.
I think the law considers that things may not always be ideal for you to give the letter immediately.
Yeah, yeah.
And some employees would sit down and say, oh, I'm not moving until I get my letter. The law doesn't say the letter has to be provided immediately. All the law says is that the employer must provide the letter within 7 days. The law goes further to say if the employer does not provide the letter within 7 days, the language uses he or she is stopped from providing any evidence if the termination is challenged. Meaning, so you terminate me, you have 7 days to set your head and to put together a reasoned position as to why you would have terminated. If you have not done so within that period, and I challenge the termination to be unfair, you are not allowed to provide any counter argument to what I provided, because you had that window of your 7 days to gather yourself, put pen to paper, as we say, and provide a precise reason. And when you speak of a precise reason, it has to be the issue or the point that, as we said, the straw that broke the camel's back. And that straw has to be a significant straw. It cannot be piled onto other offenses that would have occurred in the past, because they by themselves were not significant enough to terminate. So essentially saying each case of an offense committed by an employee, if you want to call it that, must be measured on its own merit. So you have to look at the reason given for the termination and whether or not that reason is justified.
I don't know, that seems somewhat advantageous to the employee.
To the employee, how so?
In that, really, as you explained, there has to be a particular precise. So it's not like you're looking at a track record of incidents or actions by the employee that would have, violated the conditions of
But
employment.
it doesn't, and when we started, we said that the law on our labor code is complete, and I would have said that the section that deals with unfair dismissal gives the procedures that are to be followed so as to ensure that you don't misstep, so you don't terminate unfairly. And so where it is that an employee commits an offense, the law says, and I think that's C-59(1), that if the offense is not significant enough to cause you to terminate, you must write to that employee outlining the offense and to state your dissatisfaction with it, and also state that if you commit the same offense or a similar offense in the future, the action you intend to take. So again, it is not as advantageous to the employee as you've outlined. It doesn't put the employer at a disadvantage because it gives the employer an option. And I think a lot of times the challenge that I have encountered with respect to employers on that issue is that they fail to write.
Okay.
We say we allow it to fester and then you just explode, and then you take a decision and you terminate. No, you would have terminated unfairly. You must write to the employee indicating that this is an offense that you've committed. It is not significant enough for me to terminate you, but I am not pleased with it. I would not wish for you to repeat it. If you do, this is what I intend to do. And it could be an offense that, even if repeated, you may not want to terminate. So you may say you will get further disciplinary action up to suspension.
Yeah.
And for protection, some employers may say including and up to termination.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean that they are compelled to exercise that option of termination. Again, it is somewhat discretionary on the part of the employer how they deal with those other things. But to protect the employer, the law is clear as to what the employer must do.
Okay.
And if you fail to do it, the law says that your actions are unfair to the employee.
Okay. Okay. Very, very clear understanding.
One of the things that I would like to highlight here, and skip some of those and go to vacation,
Okay.
because I've encountered situations where it becomes a debate. The issue of whether or not, if the employer pays me for my vacation, pays me in lieu of vacation, right? So I need some extra cash, and I said, boss, you can pay me 10 days out of my vacation, and he gives you the cash equivalent of whether or not I am still entitled to those 10 days. That has been a debate. And based on the law says you are entitled because on the 6th, so we're looking at C18 and we're looking at subsection 6, it says, an employer shall not compel an employee to forego the taking of earned leave, even though he pays in lieu thereof.
Wow. Yeah, that's very
So
clear. Yeah, that's
you
clear.
are
Yeah.
still entitled to those days. The only thing, when you have those days, they're days without pay because you've already been paid for
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
But there are those employers who say, I've already paid you in lieu.
Yeah.
And one employer said to me at one point that in lieu means in place of. So having paid you in place of, you are no longer eligible or entitled to those days. But that is not what the law says.
Okay. And it's very clear, as you said.
Very clear.
Yeah,
But
very
I
clear.
think the technical part that the employer used was in lieu
In lieu.
of.
Well, their
With
understanding
their
of in lieu.
understanding is mean in place of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's one other area that I want to jump back at. I think we skipped over it, just briefly mentioned it, and that has to do with holidays. Holidays. So do I have to work on a public holiday? This has been a question that has arisen in for a while now in
That
different
is
quarters.
that has been a significant debate nationally.
Yes.
Under C14, it says subject to subsection 2, no employee shall be obligated to work on a public holiday except in emergency situations. And that has been the section that has led to the debate. No, we have to be reasonable in our application of the law. Yes, the law is clear that you're not obligated to work on a public holiday. But is the law meaning that I go into an industry that is tourism oriented or operates 7 days a week and I'm offered employment on a shift basis so I know I'll be working? I don't know that the law really addresses that particular situation. And by that I mean, I think it is reasonable. There are those who may not agree with my assessment of that situation, but I think it is reasonable that if you go for employment, you apply for employment, because one, before you even apply, you should have done your research to know the nature
Yeah.
of the business,
Yeah.
its operating hours, how
That
it
makes
works.
sense. Yeah.
Having made the application, you've done your interview, and the interviewer is telling you how the business works. And in that, you recognize you may be required to work on a public holiday. And at that point, you do not raise an objection, but you accept at that point the employment which is offered. I think you then obligate yourself. You would have given up your rights that the labor code gives you. I believe that it is at that point, if you have an issue with the nature of the business and the requirement that will be placed on you to work a public holiday, that is when you exercise your right. It's just the same as if you don't want to work on the days of worship, whichever day you worship,
Yeah.
and you go to the employer and the employer says, my business is 7 days a week. and I'm going to require you to work any 6, and you don't speak up and say,
Yeah.
I will not be available on this particular day because of my religious belief, whatever, but you accept the employment, knowing that this is required, you cannot thereafter come back and say, I'm not available. Essentially, you would have been in breach of your employment agreement. Because if the reverse was true, the union would, the employee would cry foul.
Yeah.
Meaning, if I gain employment here at the Antigua Barbuda Workers Union, the union operates 5 days a week. If the union decides I want to begin to open on Saturday and I'm going to need you to come out on Saturday, that represents a change to the terms and conditions of my employment. The employer at that point cannot compel me.
Yeah.
So likewise, in the other situation we were discussing, you can't compel the employer to accede to any request that you make.
That seems reasonable. Okay, so we've done quite a bit today. Perhaps we have time enough just to touch on one or two other things before we break this session. But of course, viewers, we will come back to do future sessions on the labor code. Let's just touch 2 more issues and then we can call it a wrap.
Going back to part 1, because I think the discussion has ventured over into part 2 when we began to speak about leave and
Yes,
a little
yes, of
further when
course.
you talk about unfair termination.
Yes.
But back to part 1, of significant interest for me is that area that speaks to under C2, that every workman should know what his job consists of. I think we spoke of that. But under B of that area, it says that every workman is entitled to a reasonable break in employment, whether because of physical disability or for rest and rehabilitation. Now, on the C24, that is expounded on a bit further, where it says that within every period of 7 days, you must have at least 24 hours break. And I think what that is essentially saying is that you are permitted to work up to 6 days a week, 8 hours a day, 48 hours a week. The labor code speaks to that 48 as well. But you must have a rest day in between there in every consecutive 7 days.
Okay.
And a lot of times you don't have that. You don't have it because and the grouping of employees that you often find that in, they are the lowest paid. And so you find that they're trying to go above and beyond
Yeah.
to make that extra dollar to make ends meet.
Yeah.
And so that is why that happens. But it lends to burnout. It lends eventually to reduce productivity. You could have accidents and so occurring. That is why the law requires that you have that period for resting and rehabilitation.
Yeah.
So yes, the dollar is important, but I think most important is your health. If you have your health, you will be well enough to work another day and gain even better employment that maybe you don't even have to work 6, you could work 5.
Correct, yeah.
Right? So as we say loosely, health is wealth, but there's a significant meaning behind of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously that's a very important point to underscore. And perhaps a obvious follow-up question to much of the discussion that we've had today. If, for example, a worker, an employee finds, based on this discussion, that a lot of their rights in the labor code, enshrined in the labor code, are being violated, what are the next steps that they should be taking?
There are those among us who can, read and represent themselves, having acquired the knowledge. those who may need a little support, and the Antigua and Barbuda Workers Union is always here to lend that support. Even if it is that you're not sure, you think you may be right, but you just want to be sure, we're here. Give us a call, and we will provide you with the assistance and guidance that you need. Even better, we encourage you to join the Antigua and Barbuda Workers Union.
Absolutely. Hugh Joseph, Senior Industrial Relations Officer here at the Antigua and Barbuda Workers Union. He has over 20 years of experience in industrial relations. I'm very happy to have had you as a guest on the Workers Podcast. I'm looking forward to having you back on more occasions in the future for us to continue our deep dive into the Antigua and Barbuda Labor Code. Thank you again for being with us.
You're quite welcome, anytime.
Excellent. Now, that's going to do it for us here on this edition of the Workers Podcast. Do remember to join us every week. We upload new videos to our YouTube channel every Friday. So thank you again for being here with us on the Workers Podcast. I'm Andy Sineja.